Renata Voss laughed so loudly the valet turned around. Is that a truck or a tetanus risk? Daniel Reyes did not look up from the hood. Inside his pocket was a wrench his mentor gave him the day before he died. Renata didn't know the name on the toolbox. She didn't know her own father's handwriting was etched into the engine block under her hand. She only knew the truck was blocking 3 spaces reserved for her board. "Move it," she said, "before I have it towed and crushed." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag older than her company. "It's not going anywhere," he said. "Neither am I." The crowd at the gala entrance went quiet enough to hear the fountain behind them. Then a voice nobody expected cut through the silence. Her own father's voice, alive in the mouth of a man she'd just humiliated, saying 4 words that would unmake everything she thought she knew about where she came from. The truck was a 1987 Chevrolet, the color of a faded chalkboard, with a dent in the rear quarter panel, shaped like a thumbprint pressed into clay. Daniel Reyes had owned it for 11 years, longer than he'd owned almost anything else in his life, including the house he'd lost and the marriage that went with it. The bench seat was cracked along the seams, patched with silver tape that had yellowed at the edges. A pine air freshener, long stripped of scent, still hung from the mirror because his daughter had put it there when she was 4, and he had never had the heart to take it down. Mara was 7 now. She had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of going quiet before she said something important. Every morning, before she would eat a single bite of cereal, she lined up her crayons on the kitchen table by color, red first, then orange, then yellow, working her way through the spectrum like she was tuning an instrument only she could hear. If a crayon was out of order, she noticed immediately, the way some children notice when a word is misspelled. Daniel never asked her why. He'd learned a long time ago that some things didn't need explaining, only patience. He ran a 1-bay garage on the edge of town, the kind of place with a hand-painted sign and a bell over the door that hadn't worked in years. Most of his customers were regulars, people who trusted him with oil changes and brake jobs and the occasional engine that wouldn't turn over on a cold morning. None of them knew that 15 years earlier, Daniel Reyes had been one of 3 apprentices hand-selected by Augustin Voss, a man whose name was still spoken with something close to reverence in the small, rarefied world of vintage automotive restoration. Augustin had built engines for collectors who flew them in from 3 continents. He had also, in the last years of his life, built something else, a young mechanic out of raw instinct and grief, after Daniel's own father died, and left him a toolbox and nothing else. Daniel kept that history the way he kept most things, folded up small and put away. He didn't talk about Augustin Voss. He didn't talk about the 2 years he'd spent in that workshop, learning to listen to an engine the way other men listened to music, learning to read the wear pattern on a bearing like a doctor reads an X-ray. When Augustin died, Daniel had gone to the funeral, stood in the back, and left before anyone could ask him who he was. He'd taken nothing from that world except a wrench with a worn leather grip, a habit of working in total silence, and a private, unspoken belief that real expertise didn't need an audience. That night, the night the gala happened, was supposed to be ordinary. Daniel had picked Mara up from her after-school program, and they'd driven downtown because the truck needed a part from a specialty shop that only opened late on Thursdays, and because Mara liked to look at the big glass building on the corner, with the chandelier visible through the lobby windows, 3 stories up, glowing like something from a story she hadn't finished reading yet. "Can we go inside one day?" she asked, pressing her palm to the window. "Maybe," Daniel said, the way he said most things he didn't believe would happen. He parked the truck in the loading zone outside the shop, planning to be in and out in 10 minutes. He didn't know that the building behind him belonged to Voss Prestige Holdings, the auction and acquisitions firm Augustin's daughter had built out of her father's name and her own appetite for spectacle. He didn't know that tonight was the unveiling of the firm's new flagship gallery, that 200 guests in formal wear were already filing through the doors, that a string quartet was tuning in the lobby, and that the loading zone he'd parked in had been quietly reserved, without a single posted sign, for the firm's board. Inside the shop, the specialty part wasn't ready. The clerk apologized, said 15 minutes, asked if he wanted to wait. Daniel said he would. He went back out to check on Mara, who had stayed in the truck with her stuffed fox, Copper, worn thin at the ears from years of being carried everywhere. That was when the valets started circling. That was when a black town car pulled up behind the Chevrolet, unable to pass, and a woman, in a deep green gown, stepped out onto the curb, with the particular irritation of someone who had never once in her adult life been made to wait. Daniel didn't know her name yet. He only knew the way she looked at his truck, not with anger, not yet, but with the flat, dismissive disbelief of someone encountering something so far beneath her attention that it barely registered as an obstacle. It registered as a malfunction, something to be removed. He went back to the hood, because the radiator cap had been sitting loose since the weekend, and he didn't like the way it looked, and because focusing on small, fixable things had always been easier for him than looking up. He didn't yet know that the woman behind him was the daughter of the man who'd taught him everything. He didn't know that the conversation about to happen would tear open a part of his life he'd folded shut 15 years ago, and never once tried to unfold again. He only knew that Mara was watching from the cracked bench seat, holding Copper a little tighter, and that whatever was about to happen, he wanted her to see her father stay calm. Renata Voss had built her company on the principle that perception was inventory, that what something looked like mattered as much as what it was, sometimes more. She had inherited her father's name and his client list, but not, she would have said if pressed, his patience for sentiment. Augustin had spent hours running his hand along a fender before he'd say a word about its value. Renata could price a car from a photograph in under a minute. Tonight, the gallery behind her held $40 million of curated automotive history, lit to look like sculpture, and there was a rust-bitten pickup truck parked in her loading zone like a stain on a white tablecloth. "This is a private event," she said, walking toward Daniel with the clipped efficiency of someone delivering a verdict rather than starting a conversation. "You need to move your vehicle." Daniel straightened, wiped his hands on the rag, and looked at her with the particular stillness that unsettled people who were used to being either obeyed or argued with. He gave her neither. "I'll be out of your way in 10 minutes, he said. "Parts almost ready." "You have 2. He nodded once, like the number didn't matter to him, and went back to the radiator cap. It was the not arguing that did it. Renata had spent 15 years learning to read a room, and the man in front of her wasn't performing deference, and he wasn't performing defiance either. He was simply continuing to work, as if her deadline existed in a separate conversation he hadn't agreed to join. That, more than the dent or the chalkboard paint or the cracked vinyl seat, was what made her angry. A valet hovered near the town car, phone already half raised to call a tow service. 2 photographers near the gallery entrance, drawn by the commotion the way photographers are always drawn to friction, lifted their cameras. Guests in tuxedos and gowns slowed on the steps, the particular pleasure of watching someone else's confrontation working its way through the crowd like a low electrical current. "Did you drive this here on purpose?" Renata asked, loud enough now that the question wasn't really for him anymore. "Is that the look? Vintage authenticity? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like something that should have been scrapped during the first Bush administration." A ripple of laughter moved through the gathering crowd, the easy kind that costs the people laughing nothing. Daniel didn't answer. He checked the cap, found the seat he wanted, and set it down with the same unhurried precision he brought to every engine he'd ever touched. Mara watched through the windshield, Copper pressed against her chest, her small hands very still in her lap. She had seen her father absorb insults before, from customers who didn't want to pay full price, from men who assumed a single dad with grease under his nails had nothing else to offer the world. She had never seen anyone enjoy it the way this woman seemed to. "Is that a truck or a tetanus risk?" Renata said, and this time the laughter was bigger, because she'd aimed it like a line, the kind delivered for an audience rather than a person. A photographer's flash caught the moment. Renata mid-gesture, Daniel motionless at the open hood, the chalkboard gray truck between them like evidence. "Move it," she said, the warmth gone entirely now, replaced by something colder and more administrative. "Before I have it towed and crushed." Daniel set the rag down on the fender. He looked at her, not with anger, which she might have known how to manage, but with something closer to assessment, the way he looked at an engine before deciding where the real problem lived. "It's not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Neither am I." The words weren't loud, but they landed in the kind of silence that makes everything louder. Somewhere behind Renata, the string quartet in the lobby had paused between pieces, and for 3 or 4 seconds, the only sound on the sidewalk was the fountain at the gallery entrance and the distant tick of Daniel's engine cooling. Renata felt the crowd's attention shift, not away from her, but onto the shape of the moment itself, the way an audience leans forward when a scene stops being comedy and becomes something else. She didn't like the feeling. She reached for the only tool she had left, the one that had always worked before. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "No," Daniel said. "Should I?" It wasn't insolence. It was, infuriatingly, the truth. He genuinely didn't know, and his not knowing was somehow worse than if he had. Renata opened her mouth to answer, to deliver the line about Voss Prestige Holdings and 40 years of her family's name in this industry, when her eye caught something she hadn't noticed before. The open hood, the engine inside it, older than the truck itself, clearly rebuilt by hand, clearly maintained by someone who treated it like it mattered. There was a particular pattern of weld along the engine mount, a signature, almost, a habit she had seen exactly once before, drilled into a craftsman's hands by a teacher who believed there was only one correct way to finish a seam. She had watched her father do that weld 1,000 times as a child, sitting on an overturned bucket in his workshop, swinging her legs, waiting for him to notice she existed. She didn't say anything yet. She told herself it was coincidence. She told herself a lot of things, standing on that sidewalk, in the seconds before her certainty cracked. "Tow it," she said instead, turning to the valet, her voice tighter now than she intended. "I want it gone before the doors open." Mara, inside the truck, finally spoke, her voice small but clear enough to carry. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" Daniel reached through the open window and rested his hand briefly on top of her head, the gesture more answer than any sentence could have been. "No," he said, "we're fine." But Renata had already turned away, walking back toward the gallery steps with her phone in her hand, dialing someone, her composure rebuilding itself with every step, except for the small, persistent detail she could not stop turning over. The weld, the exact angle of it, the exact impossible familiarity of it. She didn't yet know why it bothered her. She would, in less than 10 minutes, and by then it would be too late to take back anything she'd said. The tow truck took longer than the valet promised, which gave Daniel exactly the time he needed. He went back to the radiator cap, then to the belt tension he'd been meaning to check for a week, working with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had decided, somewhere in the last 5 minutes, that he would rather be found doing something useful than standing around waiting to be humiliated twice. He didn't notice the man who had drifted out from the gallery entrance until a shadow fell across the engine bay. "That's a 350 small block," the man said. He wore a tuxedo that didn't quite fit him the way tuxedos fit men who were used to wearing them, and a lanyard with a laminated badge that read, "Consulting Appraiser, Voss Prestige Holdings, Board Out, Custom Cam." He crouched slightly, studying the valve covers with the particular focus of someone whose entire career depended on noticing details other people missed. "Who did this work?" "I did," Daniel said. The appraiser, whose name was Felix Onwuka, had spent 11 years authenticating engines for an industry that paid him well, precisely because he didn't get things wrong. He looked at the weld along the manifold, the way the timing chain had been hand-set rather than factory-installed, the small brass tag wired discreetly to the firewall, a habit so specific, so deliberately old-fashioned, that he had only ever seen it taught one place. "This weld pattern," Felix said slowly. "I've seen this exact technique exactly once before. A man trained an entire generation of restorers to finish a seam this way. Said it was the only way to keep the metal from fatiguing under heat cycling." He straightened up, and something in his posture had changed. The casual curiosity replaced by something closer to alertness. Augustin Voss. Daniel's hands stopped moving over the belt, just for a second. Then he resumed, evenly, like nothing had happened at all, though something had, deep and sudden, somewhere behind his ribs. "You knew him," Felix said. It wasn't a question anymore. "I worked for him," Daniel said, "a long time ago." Felix looked at him with new eyes, not the dismissive glance of a man assessing a stranger's truck, but the careful, recalculating attention of someone realizing he might be standing in front of something significant. He pulled out his phone, typed quickly, the way people do when they want to verify a hunch before they say it out loud. A moment later, he turned the screen toward Daniel, almost without thinking, the way you'd show a colleague something rather than a stranger. It was an old industry directory, a registry of certified apprentices from a workshop that had closed its doors 15 years ago. 3 names. Daniel's was the second. "You're one of his 3, Felix said, quieter now, almost to himself. "I thought all 3 of you had." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. The unspoken word disappeared, but Daniel could fill in the silence well enough. Vanished. Disappeared into ordinary lives, the way rare things sometimes do when no one's looking. Across the sidewalk, near the gallery steps, Renata Voss had been watching the exchange with growing unease, the kind that starts as a prickle at the base of the neck and works its way slowly into something undeniable. She crossed back toward them, heels sharp against the pavement, the irritation in her face now edged with something closer to dread. "What is going on?" she said. It wasn't really a question either. Felix held up the phone, and to his credit, he didn't soften it for her. "Renata, this is one of your father's 3. For a moment, Renata Voss, who had spent her entire adult life learning to control a room, who had never once in 15 years of running an auction house let her face show more than she intended it to, simply stood there. Her eyes moved from the phone to Daniel's hands, still resting on the engine, still and certain, and then to the weld pattern along the manifold that she now recognized, with a clarity that made her stomach drop. She remembered being 9 years old, sitting on an overturned paint bucket in her father's workshop, watching him run a torch along a seam with a patience she had never understood as a child, and had spent her adult life systematically unlearning. She remembered him explaining, more to himself than to her, why the angle mattered, why most restorers cut corners here, why he refused to. She remembered, too, something she had buried so deep she'd nearly convinced herself it never happened. Her father, in the last year of his life, mentioning a young apprentice with no formal training, and an instinct he said he'd only seen once before, in himself. A boy who'd lost his own father and arrived at the workshop with nothing but a toolbox and a willingness to listen. Augustin had talked about him with something close to pride, something Renata, 18 and resentful, and certain her father loved his work more than his daughter, had refused to ask more about. "What's your name?" Renata said. Her voice had lost its edge entirely. It had lost almost everything. "Daniel Reyes." She said nothing for several seconds. Inside the truck, Mara had rolled the window down a few inches, watching the adults with the careful attentiveness of a child who senses that something important is happening, even if she doesn't have the vocabulary for it yet. "My dad used to say things like that," Mara offered, to no one in particular, her small voice cutting cleanly through the silence. When he's quiet, it means he's thinking really hard. He doesn't talk when he's thinking. He just does it. It was a child's observation, simple and unguarded, but it landed in the small crowd that had gathered, like something far heavier than its size suggested. Renata looked at the girl, then at the man beside the open hood, who had still not raised his voice, had still not defended himself, had simply continued, all evening, to be exactly what he was. Her certainty, the bedrock of perception she'd built her entire career on, the instinct that told her in one glance what a thing was worth, had just cracked clean down the middle, and standing on the sidewalk in her green gown, with 200 guests behind her, she had no idea yet how deep the fracture went. Renata didn't go back inside the gallery. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, watched the tow truck idle uselessly at the curb, and then waved it off with a short, sharp gesture that the driver understood well enough to obey without question. "Give me a minute," she told Felix, and walked a short distance away, toward the fountain, her heels loud on the stone, until she stopped moving entirely. When she came back, she had composed herself the way she'd learned to compose herself for boardrooms and difficult negotiations, face arranged, voice level, the panic folded somewhere out of sight. But her eyes, when they found Daniel again, carried something different than they had 10 minutes earlier. "I'd like to speak with you," she said, privately, inside. "I'm fine where I am," Daniel said. "It's about my father." Daniel closed the hood, gently, the way a man closes a door he doesn't want to slam, even though he has every right to. "Then you can say it here." Renata glanced once at Mara, still in the truck, still watching, and something in that glance, brief, assessing, the habit of a woman used to identifying leverage in any negotiation, made Daniel go very still. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mara," he said, "go on inside the shop and tell the man at the counter I said you could have one of the orange sodas from the cooler. I'll be right there." Mara looked between her father and the woman in green for a second longer than necessary, the way children do when they understand more than the adults around them realize, then climbed out and walked toward the shop door, copper tucked under one arm. Only when the door had swung shut behind her did Daniel turn back. "Say what you need to say." Renata's offer, when it came, was careful, rehearsed in the 60 seconds it had taken her to walk to the fountain and back. She would compensate him generously, she said, for the truck, for his time, for the inconvenience of tonight. She would arrange a formal consulting position, a title, a salary that would have made his garage's monthly take look like pocket change. All he had to do, she said, was let the matter rest quietly, not deny the connection to her father exactly, just not make it a public conversation. Not tonight, not with cameras outside. Her company had built its reputation on her father's name, on the story she had carefully curated about who had carried his legacy forward, and an unknown apprentice surfacing at her own gala, in front of journalists, complicated a narrative she had spent 15 years constructing. "You're asking me to disappear again," Daniel said. It wasn't an accusation. He said it the way he'd describe a faulty part, flatly, accurately. "I'm asking you to let me handle this the right way, privately, with dignity." "I've had dignity for 15 years, Daniel said. "I didn't need your help for that." Something in his voice, still quiet, still without anger, made Renata's prepared offer feel suddenly thin in her own mouth. She had expected gratitude, or negotiation, or at minimum, hesitation. She had not expected a man who looked at money the way Daniel was looking at it now, like an object slightly beneath his attention. "This is a significant sum," she said. "I'm sure it is." He picked the rag back up off the fender, folded it once, twice, the small mechanical habit of a man returning to work, because there was nothing left to discuss. "Your father taught me that the value of a thing isn't what someone's willing to pay to make it go away." Renata stood there a moment longer, the offer still hanging unanswered in the space between them, and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives too late to be useful, that she had just offered to buy silence from the one person who might actually be able to tell her something true about her own father, and he had simply declined, the same way he'd declined to move his truck 2 hours and a lifetime ago. She turned and walked back toward the gallery alone, past the photographers who were still milling near the entrance, past the guests, who had mostly lost interest and drifted back to their champagne. She did not look back at the truck, though she wanted to. Daniel reopened the hood, not because there was anything left to fix, but because his hands needed something to do, while the rest of him settled. Inside the shop, through the window, he could see Mara at the counter, orange soda in hand, watching him with the patient, unworried attention of a child who trusted that whatever had just happened, her father had handled it the way he handled everything, quietly, and without needing anyone's permission to be exactly who he was. It took 6 weeks for the second event to be arranged. Not by Renata's marketing team, who had wanted to construct something glossier, but by Felix Onwuka, who insisted that what happened next needed to happen the right way, in front of the right people, with no spin attached to it at all. The gallery looked different in daylight. The chandeliers were dark, the champagne absent, the floor cleared of the velvet ropes that had cordoned off $40 million of curated history 6 weeks earlier. In their place stood folding chairs, 3 rows deep, filled with restorers, appraisers, 2 journalists from trade publications, and a small handful of the original gala guests, who had heard enough about what happened on the sidewalk that night to want to see how it ended. Daniel's truck sat at the center of the room, on a low platform usually reserved for million-dollar coupes, looking exactly as it had looked for 11 years, chalkboard gray, thumbprint dent, silver tape along the bench seat. Beside it, mounted on an easel, was a single-framed document, a worn registration card from Augustin Voss's private workshop, dated 15 years earlier, bearing 3 names. Daniel's, written in Augustin's own hand, sat second on the list. Felix stood at a small podium and spoke for less than 4 minutes. He didn't dramatize it. He simply explained, with the same precision he brought to every appraisal, what the weld pattern indicated, what the hand-set timing chain indicated, what the brass tag wired discreetly into the firewall, a habit so specific to one teacher that it functioned almost like a signature, indicated. He explained that of Augustin Voss's 3 certified apprentices, 2 had gone on to build prestigious public careers in the industry. The third had vanished from every record 15 years ago, after a family loss, and had not touched the world of formal restoration since. Until 6 weeks ago, Felix said, when he stopped outside this building in a truck, most of you would have driven past without a second look. The room was quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet, when people are recalculating something they thought they already understood. Then came the number. A private collector, present that day specifically because Felix had reached out to him weeks earlier, had examined the truck's engine in detail and made an offer, not for the truck itself, but for Daniel's services, a multi-year consulting and restoration contract structured around exactly the kind of work Augustin Voss had once done. The figure, read aloud, climbed slowly through the room, the way numbers do when no one quite believes them yet. 6 figures, then 7. The final sum, settling somewhere that made even the journalists in the back row stop typing for a moment and simply listen. Daniel didn't speak through any of it. He stood beside his daughter, who had been allowed to sit in the front row in a dress she'd chosen herself, copper held in her lap, watching her father's face rather than the document or the number or the room full of strangers. She didn't fully understand the figures being discussed. She understood, instead, the particular stillness in her father's jaw, the way his eyes had gone slightly bright without ever once spilling over, and she understood that whatever was happening, it mattered more than almost anything that had happened to them before. Renata Voss approached last, after the room had quieted, walking alone without her usual entourage of assistants and lawyers. She didn't extend an apology dressed up as a speech. She simply stood in front of Daniel and said, "I should have recognized what my father saw in you before anyone had to tell me." Daniel extended his hand. She took it. Nothing more was said between them, and nothing more needed to be. Felix turned the framed registration card around so the room could see it clearly. Daniel's name, written 15 years ago, in handwriting that would never be mistaken for anyone else's. Beneath it, a clerk had already added a line that morning, a formal, public restoration of his name to the Voss Workshop's official record, the same record that had, for 15 years, quietly omitted him. Mara tugged at her father's sleeve as the small crowd began to applaud, the sound unfamiliar and a little overwhelming in a room that had, 6 weeks earlier, treated him like an inconvenience to be towed away. "Daddy," she whispered, "is this because of the truck?" Daniel knelt down so he was level with her, the applause still moving through the room behind him. "No," he said, "it's because of the work." The garage looked the same. The bell over the door still didn't ring. The hand-painted sign still leaned half an inch to the left, the way it had for 11 years, because Daniel had never gotten around to fixing it, and had eventually decided he liked it that way. He came home early that evening, earlier than he had in months, the light still gold and low across the parking lot, when he pulled the truck in beside the shop, instead of leaving it out front like he usually did. Mara noticed before he said anything. She always noticed. Inside, he made dinner the way he always made it on ordinary nights. Grilled cheese. The pan a little too hot. The bread a little too dark at the edges. Exactly the way she liked it. She sat at the kitchen table lining up her crayons by color before she'd touch her plate. Red to orange to yellow. The small private ritual she'd kept every morning, and most evenings for as long as he could remember. After dinner, they sat together on the porch step, the truck visible in the driveway, no longer just a truck to either of them, though it looked exactly as it always had. Same dent, same chalkboard gray, same silver tape along the seams. Daniel had turned down every offer to buy it. He'd taken the consulting contract, the studio space, the title that came with it, but the truck stayed in the driveway, unchanged, because some things weren't meant to be improved into something else. They were meant to be kept. In his shirt pocket, where it had lived for 15 years, was the wrench his mentor had given him, Augustin's wrench, the leather grip worn soft and dark from 2 men's hands instead of 1. He took it out sometimes, not to use it, just to hold it, the way some people hold a photograph. Mara leaned against his shoulder, copper tucked under one arm, watching the light fade slowly behind the trees at the end of the street. "Dad," she said, in the unhurried, half-thinking voice she used, right before she said something that surprised him. "Did the truck know you were looking for it? Or did it know you were the one it was waiting for?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at her, then at the truck in the driveway, then at the wrench resting quietly in his palm. He didn't explain the difference between the 2 versions of her question, and he didn't pretend to know which one was true. He simply put his arm around her, the way he had on 100 ordinary evenings before this one, and let the quiet sit between them, the way quiet had always sat between him and the people who understood him best. Inside, he set the wrench back on the shelf above the workbench, beside the framed registration card with his name on it, and turned off the light. Some things spend their whole lives waiting, not to be found by just anyone, but to be recognized by the one person who was trained, by loss and by love, to finally see them clearly.